Hello everyone and welcome to this edition of ExchangeWire Voxpops, which we're filming from ATS Singapore. Delighted to be joined today by Chris Mottershead, Commercial Director APAC for Publica.
Hi Rachel, how are you?
Hi Chris,
Good
very well, thank you. Yes, I'm glad that you were able to join us here today. It's been a fantastic two-day event, but I want to have a chat with you about data-driven TV. So I was wondering if we could kick off with you telling me your view of the opportunity for data-driven TV here in APAC beyond YouTube.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for having me, Rachel. So yeah, look, it's a very, I'd say, fragmented outlook when you're talking about the data in terms of supply. It involves numerous participants. So we start kind of at a global level. So in APAC, we've now seen platforms like Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Hulu. They've all made a presence now in region. And they come with their own unique signals and targeting parameters that they can offer. We're also seeing as well a lot more of the localized platforms, so like ZTV, View, Stan, NDTV. Again, local platforms that offer various targeting parameters within their environments. Also, you've got the OEMs, so like Samsung, who have built-in fast electronic programming guides, which offer their own targeting parameters, and again, a proprietary way to target using their data points. And also what's interesting, we heard last week, Microsoft has announced they're going to use browser and search data within their environment to target for CTV. Amazon as well is going to be using, I think, 5 target markets now, Australia being one of them, where they'll use the Amazon Prime shopping data and again, overlay that into how they're targeting across CTV environments, which if you think about it, that's kind of Elysium of O&O proprietary targeting. Again, all pseudo walled gardens, and there's going to have to be a way to federate and stitch that consumer journey together, which we're a long way from doing. But there's definitely a lot of action happening. And then just from a more objective perspective, you have Trade Desk now with UID 2.0, LiveRamp ID, which is getting a lot of uptake from publishers now. So a lot of moving pieces there, but it's definitely a vast data ecosystem alongside YouTube.
And how are you, that's a huge amount of fragmentation. So who is sort of helping brands and advertisers come to grips with this? I mean, as you've said, ideally there'd be a way of stitching together all the opportunities across these platforms, but what's actually happening right now in order to try to support brands and agencies navigate their way around that fragmentation in this region?
Yeah, so there's a few things happening right now. So I think the main, like what underpins all of this, first of all, is the measurement. So having that single currency where you can again stitch that targeting together. I think there's still a long way to go as to how that works. Also, APAC, unlike the US, is a very densely populated region, different countries, territories, their own legislation. So that's also going to prevent, or I guess maybe create some friction points around how you come to a unique privacy identifier across all of these different regions and markets. What we are seeing in Australia, which I'd say is probably the most advanced or mature CTV market right now in our region, broadcasters are looking to pass on an identifier across their environments to give the buyers more of a holistic view as to where they are within their ecosystem, which opens up the supply, but also it gives buyers a lot less pain around how you manage that targeting, the frequency capping, the sequential messaging. I think we'll start to see that happening a lot more. You've also got as well more bundling now happening. So if you've got MVPDs, if you've got telcos, or again in APAC, very mobile centric, the 5G networks, they're starting to bundle streaming packages with their mobile plans. So those logins and those identifiers, they're being shared now, which is giving buyers a lot more viewability and I guess sequential opportunities within those environments. So a lot of the, I'd say, more data sharing happening. It has to be done in a compliant ordinance, but I think they're probably the early green shoots of how we're starting to do that. But ultimately it's underpinned by, I think, measurement councils like we have in Europe and with the JICs and agreeing on that single currency. We're still a long way from that, but there are definitely progresses happening in there.
Yeah. And what would you, just thinking about maybe some of the issues or challenges that brands would face when thinking about directing their budgets towards data-driven TV, we know lots of brands are constantly concerned about brand safety, and brand suitability. What does that landscape look like for brands and marketers in data-driven TV, and are there some sort of specifics to this region that you're helping brands overcome in terms of challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, as a vendor, we're very much involved with the conversation that's happening at a more holistic level. So, for example, Publica, we're part of the IAB Video Council. We're members of AVIA, which is the Asian Video Industry Association. And what we're doing is we're working on initiatives. So, give you an example, IAB Tech Lab has Ads.Cert 2.0. And this is where you're giving everybody in the supply chain a cryptographic signature to say that you are authenticated to handle that bid request and pass back the response. This lends itself very well to environments like OpenRTB, where a lot more buyers would like to lean in, but because for what you've said, ad fraud, piracy, these are some of the real concerns that buyers have, which is why a lot of CTV deals, and I think this happens in other markets as well outside of APAC, it's heavily leaning towards direct IO, PG, PMP environments, and I think, that whole ad fraud, that security aspect of it is a huge blocker. So as a tech company and many others, we're trying to get alignment on how we authenticate the supply chains, but still got quite a long way to go, and it's definitely a legitimate concern.
And are you noticing any sort of regional variances there? As you mentioned earlier on, Australia's a pretty sophisticated, data-driven TV market. Are brands more concerned in some regions than others, or potentially even less concerned in some regions than others?
100%. So it depends where you go. And we were in Indonesia not so long ago where we met with publishers there and broadcasters. The biggest concern in that market by far is piracy. If you go to Japan, it's very focused on ad quality. So making sure that the files that are being passed through, they're being successfully transcoded and that the publisher still has absolute control over which brands are being presented across their networks. And then in Australia, it's less of a brand safety concern, but it's more of a measurement. So how are we measuring performance against all of these CTV buys? Because we already know and we're quite comfortable with the mechanics of how we're buying and selling. But like you say, it really depends on where you go, and the challenges are very nascent based on the region and their maturity, especially in the more mobile-centric markets where, again, ad fraud and bad actors are more common. And so you have to really double down on that security and making sure that we're thinking of ways to align on how we authenticate the supply chain.
Which I can imagine would be really relevant in some of the Southeast Asian markets, especially as you've already mentioned, huge. Indonesia, for example. So, with the growth of, fast environments, which, suggests a growth in advertising inventory potentially for brands and advertisers, where do you see, two questions, do you see budgets shifting into data-driven TV? And if you do you have any sort of idea of where those budgets are coming from? Are we talking about brands and marketers making new spend available for data-driven TV? Or are we talking about them moving spend from other channels into data-driven TV?
I think it's both. And also I want to say as well is that linear is certainly still very alive in our region, and it's highly valued. And I think for publishers as well that have linear inventory, it remains extremely profitable. So I think that at the moment, the best use case of FAST is to try and bridge that gap between, okay, I've reached somebody in a linear environment, how do I then do that in the digital environment, which is why the OEMs are in such a good position, because they're using ACR data now to try and close that measurement piece, but also as well reach people who don't watch linear and try and get them across digital screens. With FAST, because it's the closest relative to the traditional TV viewing experience, it's a really good way for new entrants and new brands to get into CTV, because you don't need to be part of an upfront event where you're committing hundreds of thousands. You can literally load 10K into a DSP and you can start targeting. I think as well with FAST, the appeal is that you can make more genuine partnerships and connections with audiences based on the affinities of that channel, and it's reducing the wastage. We talked earlier about socials now losing a lot of its signal because of privacy updates, people opting out of tracking. And now you've got social buyers that can deploy the same targeting they had in social, but they can do this across FAST. And rather than getting an ad on a small newsfeed on the phone, you can do that on the biggest screen in the house and still minimize the wastage. So there's definitely been, I think, a lot of successful use cases for FAST. It still has its challenges. I think profitability is still needs to be looked at. I think we still need to look at how we're indexing the pricing as well, but it's definitely got, I think, benefits to all constituents regardless of where you sit in the ecosystem.
And are you sort of aware of maybe brands, as you've said, the budget thresholds perhaps aren't as prohibitive as they could be in a linear environment. So are you aware of brands sort of pushing test budget into those fast channels, or is it really a case of having to convince brands still of the value, the ways in which they could reach the audience, other concerns that they've got before getting them to actually commit budget?
So we see FAST definitely lends itself as the more favourable testing environment. The only problem with FAST I think that the owners have is that because FAST sometimes you need to keep them sticky. When you go to break, people might change channel and therefore the content owner might lose money. So there's kind of a balance between making sure we can test in FAST, but then also the owners are very concerned about making sure they have ads that create impact straight away and keep that person within break and remain on the program. So you kind of have to get that balance quite right. And then in the AVOD space, that's where you, I think, get more of the premium inventory spots across streaming environments where they tend to be now sold more up front. But again, we'd still see now a lot of slates, and by slates I mean, you know, the countdown time is saying we'll be back in 15 seconds, 13 seconds, or we see house ads, or we see an overfrequency. So there is definitely more spots there, I think, that could be lent out into testing environments. But I feel the perception at the moment for buyers is that FAST is maybe the easiest way to test and get a good sample as to how you can run campaigns in CTV.
Fantastic. Well, data-driven TV has been a channel that we've been talking about for a long time at ExchangeWire as a growth opportunity within the industry, but specifically somewhere where we're expecting to see brands and advertisers push more spend. So thank you very much for that rundown from your perspective in the APAC region, and thanks very much for tuning into this Voxpop.